Thanks, Millie, very much. Keep Mark 8 open in front of you, and as ever, you'll see an outline on the service sheet you were given as you came through the door. A few weeks ago, I was exposed to some of the most effective advertising I've seen in a long time. It was an advert on behalf of a charity doing aid work in West Africa with blind children, restoring their sight. The advert was amazing, really. It was the story of one small boy who was blind. He'd been found by the aid workers and had been taken by them to the hospital doing the aid work. They'd seen the boy and decided he was ready for the operation. He had very severe glaucoma that meant he was effectively blind. And they operated on him. And after the operation, he spent several weeks lying on a hospital bed with bandages around his eyes, until eventually the moment came for them to take the bandages off. He was sat there in a room surrounded by doctors and nurses, and slowly but surely off came the bandages. And the camera zoomed in on his face, which was filled with shock at first as the light came flooding into his eyes, but slowly but surely as he looked around the room and then made eye contact with doctors and nurses, slowly but surely a smile inevitably spread across his face. And then in time, understandably, tears welled up in his eyes and in the eyes of all of the doctors and the nurses around him, and, if I'm honest, one or two of the people watching the advert at home. Those images, plus R. Kelly's I Believe I Can Fly, was frankly too much. Powerful advert, powerful images. But tonight we're going to see, or perhaps be reminded, that there is a universal state of blindness in humanity. And this blindness that we're going to see is even deeper and more serious than the blindness that afflicted that small boy in West Africa, because the blindness we're going to see about tonight is actually a spiritual blindness. And it's a spiritual blindness that we are incapable in and of ourselves of being healed of. So that humanity, by the end of our time in Mark 8 tonight, by nature at least, is going to look like the group of people described in H.G. Wells' short story, The Country of the Blind. H.G. Wells writes the story where he describes what is in the beginning a small group of people who set up home in a small valley in South America. Very quickly, they're afflicted by a disease that causes them to go blind. Around the same time, a natural disaster strikes that means that the valley itself is cut off from the rest of the country, the rest of the world, the rest of civilization. They grow in number until 15 generations later, he says, a small nation has formed, all of whom are blind, and none of whom know any difference. Indeed, they don't even know what the concept of sight is anymore. They just get on with their normal lives, but cut off from the rest of the world around them. That picture in The Country of the Blind is a little bit like humanity as far as Jesus is concerned tonight. Unable to see, and not knowing any difference, and as a result, desperately cut off, not from society, but from God. You see, Mark's Gospel, from chapters 1 to 8, is the story of a king who comes into the world to bring back people who have been cut off from God. I guess most of us in this room probably at some point or another have read through Mark's Gospel. And you remember the first couple of chapters where Jesus arrives like a whirlwind through Galilee, demonstrating his incredible authority. His authority over sickness, his authority over demons, his authority over the natural world, his authority in his teaching, event after event after event. But then, after a while, it becomes obvious he's going to use that authority for forgiveness of sins. And the rest of the story begins to move in that direction as slowly but surely Jesus proves and demonstrates that he's not just another man, but is in fact the Lord who will bring about a second Exodus, a fulfillment of the story of the first Exodus and a fulfillment of the promises of Isaiah, that the Lord would come one day and bring his people out of exile, out of a state of being cut off, and back into relationship with him. He's the Lord. And his identity becomes clearer and clearer and clearer across the course of those first 8 chapters. But as Jesus' stock rises across the course of those 8 chapters, the stock of his disciples pretty consistently falls across the course of those 8 chapters. In particular, there are 3 boat trips from chapters 4 to 8, where the focus is in on the disciples and their response to Jesus. The first boat trip you'll know about, it's a famous one. He is with his disciples in a boat and a storm is raging all around them. Jesus is asleep in the boat, but the disciples are petrified. And they run down and they shake Jesus awake, and he comes up, and in this life-threatening storm, he stands up and just with the words, calms the storm. Turns it from a raging storm into a mill pond. But rather than in that moment recognize Jesus as God, as he so self-evidently is from that moment, rather than fall down on their knees and worship him, instead at the end of the episode, perplexingly, they ask the question, who then is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? It's God, but they just don't seem to get it. Then the second boat trip comes along a couple of chapters later in Mark chapter 6. Again, a famous story. Jesus' disciples are in the boat this time, and Jesus decides to walk on the water next to them. Decides to, in loaded terms, pass by and reveal himself to them. And as he passes by and recognizes again their fear rather than their faith, he says those words, "Don't be afraid, it is I." Or more literally, "I am," which is a repetition of the divine name, Yahweh. He couldn't be being more clear with the disciples as to who he is. But as they look on, Mark describes them as being utterly astonished, and the story ends in Mark 6 with the words, "They did not understand because their hearts were hardened." And now at the beginning of our section tonight, Mark 8 verses 14 to 21, we come to the third and final boat trip, where we discover that the disciples' spiritual eyes are fast shut. Spiritual eyes are fast shut. You see, the warning of verses 14 to 15 that Jesus gives to his disciples is a pretty sobering one if you understand it. Mark says, "Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they only had 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he," that's Jesus, "cautioned them, saying, 'Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod.'" Now, you might wonder what's behind this enigmatic warning to his disciples. Why mention the Pharisees and Herod together? They're 2 pretty disparate groups who, normally speaking, wouldn't have hung out together. But ever since chapter 3, verse 6 of Mark's Gospel, they have been colluding together to plot the death of Jesus Christ, an unlikely pair coming together in a dastardly plan. And then chapter 6 gives us a very vivid picture of Herod and the Herodians and what they're like. You remember that deathly dinner party that Herod throws that results in him killing John the Baptist, where he shows us what the yeast of Herod is. The yeast of Herod is unrepentant immorality that kills anyone who calls them to repentance. Then chapter 7, we get a vivid picture of what the yeast of the Pharisees is. Rather than unrepentant immorality, the yeast of the Pharisees is an unrepentant, hypocritical religiosity. In one sense, at the other end of the spectrum to Herod, but in another sense, in exactly the same place. Because it also works out in them wanting to kill Jesus. And Jesus says, beware of their yeast. Beware of their yeast. You know how yeast works. You know how to make bread, don't you? No, me either. Let's pretend for a second. I think you take flour, don't you? Take flour, you take water, some eggs, pinch of... No? I'm getting a lot of... Bear with me, indulge me. Flour, water, eggs, bit of butter maybe, bit of salt, bit of pepper. Mix it all together, knead it for a while, and then, crucially, you drop in the yeast. Forget it. Yeast spreads. That's what it does. It's how you get the bread to rise. It spreads through the whole batch. Jesus says, beware of the yeast, the spreading leaven of the Pharisees and Herods. And it's actually pretty insulting when you think about it for a second. Jesus has been with this group, living with them, speaking to them, hearing what they have to say. Imagine he was among us for a little while. He heard what we had to say, saw how we conducted ourselves. Imagine someone was to turn to us, having been with us, and said, oh, beware of the yeast of Osama bin Laden. How rude. To suggest that something in the way we talk and conduct ourselves shows traces of that kind of behavior. But that's the warning that Jesus is giving to the disciples. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Herods. But rather than being insulted, actually, the disciples are so dull, they simply don't get it. And the inner Homer Simpson in them comes out. Oh, Jesus mentions leaven. They begin to think about bread. Verse 16. They began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And not only is it pretty rude of them to basically ignore and refuse to engage with what Jesus has said, but they have forgotten the fact that they are sitting in a boat with someone who routinely makes bread come from almost nowhere. How can you be worried about only having one loaf of bread when you're sitting in a boat with the guy who twice in the past few weeks has demonstrated he can produce thousands of loaves of bread out of nowhere? They're showing an incredible dullness at this moment. And Jesus wants to draw that out. Verse 19, he says, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And you can imagine a pause as Jesus kind of says, hello, is there anybody there? Do you understand what I'm saying? No. Right, let's keep going then. Verse 20. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. Still nothing. Don't you understand? We were in Jewish territory, and I did a miracle where I fed 5,000 people with bread from heaven. And at the end of it, for the 12 tribes of Israel, there were 12 baskets left over, and everyone was satisfied. Any idea? No. Okay, in Gentile territory then, I did a miracle. Again, bread from heaven such that everyone was satisfied, full of significance, full of allusion back to the Old Testament. And at the end, 7 baskets, the perfect number, the number of completion left over, and everyone was satisfied. Still, any idea? Nothing. Verse 21. He said to them, do you not yet understand? You see, the disciples very simply cannot see what it is that's in front of them, or more specifically, they cannot see who it is that is right in front of them. It's the Lord. It's the Redeemer of Israel, the rescuer of the world, right in front of their eyes, and they simply cannot see it. And Jesus knows it, verse 17. Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? They're blind. But their blindness, says Jesus, is actually a symptom of a heart defect. Did you notice just towards the end of verse 17, those powerful words, are your hearts hardened? The portrait is more and more devastating as it goes along. Spiritual blindness, hardness of heart. But back a chapter in Mark chapter 7, Jesus has already provided a devastating expose of the human heart. He describes it in a sense as being like an open sewage pipe, just pouring out the raw sewage of sin constantly, all of the time. You can see it, verse 21, just across the page. Evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within, and they defile a person. That's the state of the human heart, a conveyor belt of sin. And back in Mark chapter 4, Jesus has already talked about blindness, spiritual blindness. He's quoted from Isaiah chapter 6, where very clearly God says that he will act in judgment against sinful people by bringing hardness of heart, or more specifically, spiritual blindness or deafness, along the lines that Jesus is talking about here in verse 17 and 18. Now, all of those ideas, though, Mark 4, Mark 7, they come together, and the arrow is pointing straight at the disciples. They're blind. And we're even beginning to wonder if they're no better than the Pharisees at this point in the story. As far as the story of humanity in Mark's gospel is concerned, it's definitely a low point, because we're beginning to think if even the disciples no better than the Pharisees. One commentator says this: the disciples are presented as teetering on the edge of Pharisaic blindness. There are dark days ahead, and in the episodes to come, the disciples will continue to demonstrate pride, self-centeredness, and a lack of spiritual insight. It's a pretty depressing picture, but it's meant for us to have explanatory power. Because you see, by portraying the disciples in this way, Mark has effectively universalized the problem of human sin. Actually, Mark chapter 7 has done that for us already, talking about the human heart in the way that it has. But now we see that it's not just sinfulness, but blindness that pervades the human heart. You see, if it was the Pharisees that were being talked about here, we would expect that, wouldn't we? The Pharisees are the bad guys. They wear their black hats and their black capes. We boo when they come on the stage. That's how it works with the Pharisees. If they behave like this, we could just dismiss them. But the disciples are the good guys. They're the ones who have been showing an inclination towards Jesus, a disposition to want to listen to him. And now here we see that even they, are deaf and blind. And if they're deaf and blind, then everyone is deaf and blind by nature. But like I say, that has for us, therefore, explanatory power. It explains for us why it is, for example, that people seem often to be so oblivious to the truth of the gospel. Have you ever had that experience? I imagine you probably have, where you've tried to explain the good news of the Lord Jesus Christ to a friend of yours or to a colleague, and they've sat and they've listened, and you feel, or the person who's been explaining it has been completely lucid, clear, coherent. In fact, more than that, they've been compelling as they've put the truth of the gospel in front of people. And you think to yourself, it's so self-evidently true, and more than that, it's so self-evidently to be desired. Why would you not want to repent and believe what I'm talking about? And yet the person just walks away, either disinterested or, worse sometimes, hostile to what is obviously good news. Think of a friend of mine who, for years now, he and I have been friends and have on many occasions talked about the gospel. And 18 months ago, I was speaking at one of the carol services, and he couldn't make it along. So afterwards, I sent him the link in an email and just said, I'd love to know what you think of what I said. And about a day later, he sent an email back saying, thanks for this, really good stuff. I'm always impressed by someone who can stand up and speak coherently for half an hour. Thanks very much. What wasn't quite the engagement I was looking for. Now, I had been pretty straightforward, I think, in the talk. Indeed, at times, I'd been relatively provocative to try and stimulate people's thinking. It's almost as though he was Teflon coated. It just bounced off him, and he continues to be that way. And the reason for that is that when it comes to the gospel, the battle for the heart is not, in the first instance, intellectual or educational. In the first instance, the battle for the human heart is moral and spiritual. It explains why it is that so often people are oblivious to the truth of the gospel. It begins, I think, to explain, at least by implication, what the pattern of faithful Christian ministry should be. You see, people have said many times before, haven't they? You'll have heard it. The problem of the heart of the problem, that's right, the heart of the problem is the problem of the human hearts. And that means the solution cannot therefore be just getting people through the doors of the church. So often in our denomination, in the Church of England, there's great triumph because people just come through the doors of the church. That's where the success is. If you can just get people in, if you can just get bums on seats. But bums on seats are not the solution to a hardened heart. Indeed, nor was the performance of ritual, as though going through religious motions can soften a hardened heart. Indeed, the solution is not even trying to hit a moral mark of some kind, as though if you could just be a little bit better, if you could just pull your socks up a little bit higher, well, that would deal with the problem of blindness. Now, true Christian ministry will always, in the first instance, be focused in on Jesus Christ. It'll be prayerful and dependent, and be concerned for genuine repentance and belief. It explains why people are so often oblivious to the truth. It explains the hearts and the pattern of Christian ministry. And thirdly, and I think perhaps most importantly, it explains why salvation is always only ever by grace. Always only ever by grace. You see, this blindness we're discovering is true of every single one of us by nature. But blindness doesn't just go away. Those children in West Africa don't wake up one morning suddenly able to see. That's not how blindness works. No, in their case, and indeed in every case, if blindness is going to go away, it requires an intervention from outside. And in the case of spiritual blindness, it requires radical and miraculous intervention. But that, I think, is why Mark tells the story that he does next in verses 22 to 26, as we discover that Jesus can open blind eyes. You see, Mark, if you've read him already, you'll know is an expert storyteller. He weaves his material together intelligently and purposefully to make exactly the points that he wants to make. And here, in these 5 verses, we've got a blind man. Twice, in fact, we're told that he's a blind man. And throughout the story, the emphasis is very much on his eyes, isn't it? Understandably, his eyes and his sight are repeated again and again. And the repetition, I think, is meant to get our antennae twitching. Hang on, we've got a spiritual blindness that is talked about, and now we've got a physical blindness that is problematic. And there is a 2-stage nature to the healing here. You're going to have to come back next week if you want to understand why it is that there's a 2-stage nature to the healing. We'll get to that. But in the first instance, let's be clear that it's not because Jesus is struggling in some way, as though this is a particularly difficult miracle that is going to stretch Jesus a bit harder, or as some commentators say, as though perhaps his powers are beginning to wane somehow. Now, there's a very different reason for the 2-stageness. You'll have to wait until next week. But what is clear is that Jesus can definitively heal this blindness. Verse 25 is emphatic. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. No need for hours of surgery. No need for an extended recovery period. No need when the miracle is finished for glasses. No blurriness. Just perfect 20/20 vision. And the point of the story, I think, is very clear, therefore. When it comes to blindness, Jesus is the solution. Jesus is the solution. In this story, he's the one with compassion, able to heal. He's the one with authority. He's the one with power. He's the one and the only one who can overcome this physical blindness. And the placing of these 2 stories, the first 2 stories next to each other, I think is meant to get us thinking. If Jesus can do this for physical blindness, is it possible that he might be able to overcome spiritual blindness? Which is why the third and final episode in our story tonight comes both as a total surprise and as no surprise at all. Verse 27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Now, if the healing of the blind man wasn't present in how Mark put his story together, then verse 29 would come as a complete bolt from the blue. One moment, the disciples are, Jesus says, explicitly demonstrating spiritual blindness. And the next minute, simple Simon Peter is declaring to Jesus, "You are the Christ." A moment of incredible spiritual insight. No one in the gospel has had this kind of insight. This is the first time since chapter 1, verse 1, that the title Christ has been used. Previously, Jesus has just been teacher. Now here is Peter with incredible insight. And did you notice that the insight is not bland in any sense? He doesn't say, now I believe in God. Nor does he even say of Jesus, now I believe that you're a prophet. No, Jesus asks him the question and he replies, you are the Christ. Spiritual eyes are wide open all of a sudden. And in the course of the story of Mark's gospel, this is, as it were, a Luke, I am your father moment in terms of understanding identity. As Peter sees Jesus for who he truly is all of a sudden. He understands that he is the Christ, infinitely more powerful or more significant than Darth Vader. Because that word, Christ, just 6 letters, but dense in its meaning and its significance, loaded up with Old Testament allusion. You are the Christ. He's saying, you are the divine, eternal, universal King of everything. And by standing in front of Jesus and saying those words directly to him, he's not just saying that in an abstract sense. He's saying, you are my King. You are my Christ. And all of a sudden, miraculously, Peter can see. And he really can see. Because all of a sudden, he's describing the world the way that it really is. There is a Christ. There is a King. And he rules over everything. And when you get that, you understand it is wonderfully good news. Bob Edens was a man who was cured of blindness, aged 51, never seen before, and was given his sight through surgery. This is how he described his feelings afterwards. He said, I never would have dreamed that yellow is so yellow, but red is my favorite color. I can't believe red. I can see the shape of the moon, and of course sunrises and sunsets. And at night I look at the stars in the sky and the flashing light. You could never know how wonderful everything is. Of course, that must be what it's like to receive your physical sight. But something very similar happens when you receive your spiritual sight. Suddenly you see the world totally differently. And you echo Bob Eden's words. You could never have known how wonderful everything is. It's what it's like to know that Jesus is the Christ and to put your trust in him. And I guess we could go around the room tonight sharing stories. In fact, that might be a good thing to do if you go for a bite to eat of food over the road. Share the stories of how it was for you that you came to have that sight. For some, it might have been that it happened in a matter of minutes. For others, maybe hours, others days, some months, maybe even for some years. I guess for some in the room, you don't even know when it happened. You can't remember it. But the wonderful truth of the gospel is that if we're trusting in the Lord Jesus, it's because Jesus himself has miraculously intervened to give us sight. I remember the most vivid example of this I saw was a guy called Liam. He was a student studying at KCL about 10 years ago. And he came along to a Christianity Explored course. And for the first 3 weeks, I should say, he was basically pretty indifferent to the whole thing. He was there because he fancied a girl who had brought him along. Twiddled his thumbs for about 3 weeks. But then in the 4th week, I remember the person leading his group talking to me about it. He said it was as though the scales fell from his eyes. All of a sudden, Liam just came alive. And in a moment, halfway through the study, he looked at the study leader and said to him, as the cross had just been explained, "Are you telling me that Jesus will forgive me my sins?" And from that moment on, the conversation went on until at the end of that evening, Liam did what Jesus would exhort every person to do in Mark chapter 1, verse 15. Liam repented and believed, put his trust in Jesus, because he had been given spiritual sight. That's what Jesus can do. He can break into lives and he can give spiritual sight. In fact, that's what he has to do. It is the first step in the Christian life. And Mark, I think, wants us to be really clear about that. You see, we're about to move, and will be for the next 4 weeks, in Mark chapters 8 and 9. And Mark chapters 8, 9 and 10 are, well, interestingly, topped and tailed with the story of the healing of a blind man. The blind man here, and then blind Bartimaeus at the end of chapter 10. But in between those two healings, there's a whole load of material about what it means to be an authentic disciple of Jesus Christ. Lots of instruction, and we're going to see a certain amount of that next week. There is a high bar set for a disciple of Jesus Christ. But before you get into the do's and the don'ts of the Christian life, Mark wants us to be clear, Jesus wants us to be clear, that when it comes to following on the roads to the cross, being a disciple of Jesus, the first step is always taken by Jesus Christ. He is the one who comes towards us. He is the one who takes the initiative to bring sight to otherwise blind spiritual eyes. We were saved not because of anything in us, but rather because of what Jesus has done in us. And I know that's humbling to hear. It's humbling for me, it's humbling for you. We can't save ourselves. But whilst it's humbling, it's also hugely reassuring. Because it means if you're a person who is trusting in Jesus tonight, it's because of his initiative towards you. And he can be trusted. He'll never let you go. And you can reside comfortably in his grace as you begin to walk with him on the path towards the cross in true discipleship. One man who knew this powerfully for himself was John Newton. You probably know the story of John Newton and his conversion. He's a man who lived hundreds of years ago and was living a pretty tawdry existence. Sometimes he was referred to as the African blasphemer because he was a slave trader. He used to drive ships around the world full of slaves, selling them here and there. Not only did he sell slaves, but he was engaged in all kinds of immorality wherever he went. And yet, in a moment of clarity, as he looked back on his life before that point, he knew his existence had been a terrible one, and he understood the gospel, and he threw himself at Jesus' feet and asked him for mercy. You might say he was given spiritual eyes to see, and he repented, and he believed. And years later, as he looked back on his conversion, he wrote these words, famous words, and words that we'll sing together in a moment. Amazing grace, he said, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see.